Um, Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. It's organised by the Brexit Institute. My name is Ken McDonagh. I'm the head of the School of Law and Government here at Dublin City University. It gives you a great honour to welcome all of you to this really important session to mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which I guess for some of the younger members of today's audience is really a lifetime ago when we think about it. So it's really an honour to have one of the architects of that agreement, Taoiseach Bertie Ahern, here to speak with us and give us an insight into the fragile process that led to peace in this island over the last 25 years. And then our expert panel from this university, Professor Federico Fabbrini from UCC, Mary Murphy, and from Queen's University Belfast, Christopher McCrudden, ably emceed by Mark Landler of the New York Times. It's going to be a fruitful and interesting discussion. And one of the things that DCU as an institution really sees itself as a key part of the bridge north and south, as part of that Belfast-Dublin economic corridor, as one of the key nodes through which relations on this island can be improved and move forward. So you're all very welcome to what will, I hope, be a very interesting and fruitful discussion. And without further ado, I might pass on over to Mark Landler for the formal introductions. So you're very welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm thrilled to be asked to be part of this. I'm going to offer a few opening remarks and then turn it over quickly to the people who not only are experts in the issue, but the people who made history in the case of the Taoiseach. So Tony Blair said on the BBC the other day that the Good Friday Agreement was a model for peace processes everywhere in the world, and there's no question that the agreement fulfilled its cardinal goal, which Bertie Ahern actually put very succinctly, also speaking to the BBC, which is, quote, "We got peace and we stopped the killing," unquote. So much of the next 2 weeks will properly be a celebration of a landmark diplomatic achievement. But I hope we can also talk about the reality of Northern Ireland today, 25 years later, because it finds itself in a curious place. Politically, at least, with no functioning Stormont Assembly, which means no properly functioning executive. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and the EU broke an impasse over trade and signed the Windsor Framework, but the unionists in Northern Ireland have yet to embrace that agreement. And for that reason, among others, it's also not clear when the DUP will go back into the power sharing government, regardless of whether they can come to terms with the framework. Beyond that, politics in Northern Ireland have also developed in an interesting way over the last year. Sinn Féin is now the largest single party in the assembly, but in the elections last May, the Alliance was the party that made the largest gains over their previous performance. Which suggests some very interesting things. One, if you're an Irish nationalist, you have real cause to hope that demographics and politics are moving in your direction. But if you're not firmly in either the unionist or the nationalist camp, you also have reason to think that you're more in the political mainstream in Northern Ireland. And so one thing I'd love to explore with each of the panelists is how they see the future of power sharing and devolved government in Northern Ireland. Defenders of the Northern Ireland Protocol and advocates of the new Windsor Framework argue that these arrangements actually give Northern Ireland a sort of a unique position in the world with access to both the UK market and the EU single market. But how effectively will Northern Ireland be positioned to exploit those opportunities? So I'm sure the Taoiseach and others I'd love to hear address those issues as well. So without further ado, my job is, as I said, mainly to keep the conversation moving. And so I'm not going to bother giving you a lot of detail about a man who, in those famous words, needs no real introduction. But Bertie Ahern is actually one of the people who negotiated this agreement, the first person in over 60 years in Ireland who was elected as Taoiseach on 3 successive occasions: in June 1997, in June 2002, and again in May 2007. He served in the Irish Parliament for almost 35 years, and of course is a part of history for the agreement he signed with then Prime Minister Tony Blair. So without any further delay, I turn the floor over to the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern.
Thank you very much, Mark, and to Ken and to Fabio. I just, try to, in 17 minutes, I think I've got to try and run through the agreement as best we can, and maybe we'll try and answer the questions afterwards. I suppose in the human journey, Mark, anniversaries do play a significant role, and they serve as markers of memory, the calling to mind of an event in a period, a moment, a person or a group of people who were significant or to us personally or as a community. And that exercise of recall serves, I think, many purposes as we do over these few weeks, remembering and memorizing, honoring and reflecting. And it can also be the catalyst for renewal, which I hope it will be, a resolve to redouble efforts associated with the person or being recalled. And then, of course, landmark anniversaries like this one, I think, add significance to it. And because it is truly international, this week I've had the opportunity of talking to good journalists and academics from across the world. It almost I find it strange that so many people have such an interest in it, but I'm very grateful that they do. But I suppose if we're talking about the life of a person, a marriage, an organization, or even a country reaching the quarter-century mark has an impact of special importance. So I think marking this particular thing carries a certain degree of interest. I'm going to try and quickly run. I'm not going to go through all the people that were involved. Mark, people know them, I think, other than to say there were 10 parties and 2 governments at the start. We lost 2 parties along the way. So we ended up with 8 parties and 2 governments. A lot of help from outsiders. The President of the United States, George Mitchell as chair, John de Chastelain, the Canadian general who looked after the commission, and Harry Halkery, former Prime Minister, no longer with us. So a lot of people of international domain, and afterwards we had others as well. And of course, the person I dealt with every day throughout the period, Tony Blair, who was my colleague and friend through it all. Irish prime ministers and Irish Taoiseachs and British prime ministers weren't usually friends through history, but we managed to build up a great relationship in opposition, and that continued on for the 10 years of the agreement, and working very closely with Bill Clinton. That was hugely important to us. I suppose just to briefly run through for people who might be familiar, at the end of the 80s, after 20 full years of violence, there was a bit of reflection going on, particularly after the Enniskillen bombing. I think that was, if you wanted to mark an event, there were so many events where so many people were killed and injured and maimed, but Enniskillen bombing, I think, did touch a bit at the hearts of people who were fairly not normally touched. And I think that period in '88, the Redemptorist Order in Clonard and Father Alex Reid, Father Jerry Reynolds, they started reaching out to people, talking to Sinn Féin and talking to the Irish government. The first meeting of the Irish government with them was '88. And it didn't lead to much, quite frankly, but it did lead to all-party talks without Sinn Féin, 91, 92. A lot of people say they were a waste of effort. I don't agree. I was finance minister at the time. I wasn't on the talks team because I was in finance, but I did follow it very closely. A lot of position papers were done at that time. And where they were useful, and I won't say any more than this, where they were very useful was that for the first time since the trouble started, we got position papers on what parties wanted rather than what they didn't want. For the previous years, we got everything they didn't like. And as you know, in Northern Ireland, people find it very easy to say no. But it's to actually get a view of what they thought was very important. That moved on to the Downing Street Declaration, John Major, Albert Reynolds, A lot of people put a lot of effort into that. For those people not familiar, again, Down Street Declaration, they'll find it's only taken 10 minutes to read it, 15th of December 93. That directly led, and what that paper did, again in the sentence, was set out where the conflict was and what aspirations, objectives of people were. And to say, well, if we didn't have conflict, you know, how could we build something out of this? That led directly to the ceasefires of August 94 by Republicans, October 94 by Loyalists, 95, not much to say about 95 other than unfortunately decommissioning dominated the year. And then 96, the IRA broke the ceasefire. So that was a year of violence again. And Tony Blair and I spent 96, 97 in opposition, looking at what we would do if we got into power. Both of us got into power. He with a landslide, me with a narrow line, and very narrow line. And what our plan was, and I can put this very simply, the plan was that he would reassure unionists of his support for the union, because we had had a long period of Tory party, Conservative Party power. So there was a suspicion that the Labour Party would take a very Republican Southern Irish viewpoint, which they had traditionally. So he went to Belfast. My job was to talk to Sinn Féin and work with Sinn Féin to try and get the IRA ceasefire to start. We did that. The promise that we made to all sides was that if that happened, and particularly to Sinn Féin, that we would get into the talks quickly. So in September 1997, the talks process really started. There had been talks before for a year or two, but as George Mitchell has said, really were useless and didn't get anywhere because there was no well, anyway, that's a long story. People were going all over the place and not really discussing the issues. So in September 97, first key thing, we started the talks process. We announced that Sinn Féin were coming into the talks process, and as soon as we did that, the Democratic Unionist Party, led by Ian Paisley, they walked out of the talks, and so did the UK Unionists, a small grouping. We almost ended up on stalemate at that stage because David Trimble was expected to walk out of the talks. That's what unionism thought he would do, but he didn't. And he walked back into the talks with the two loyalist parties, UDP, PUP, and thereby started the talks that ran all the way to Good Friday. This day of Holy Thursday was the deadline set by George Mitchell. Not much happened other than a lot of talk and a lot of hot air too in the rest of 97. We had a break for Christmas, which we thought would be helpful, but that wasn't the case because there was the killing of one of the loyalist leaders in prison on St. Stephen's Day, 26th of December, and that led to violence by both Republicans and loyalists in January, February. We seem to be on the road to getting nowhere. And then George Mitchell, after the St. Patrick's Day break, which was a traditional with a lot of the parties, including myself, were in America, with President Clinton, George Mitchell said, listen, I have a young wife and a young child, a young baby, and I've given this kind of 2 years on and off. I'm out of here. So the deadline is for the Holy Thursday, this day 25 years ago, and that's it. So talks did get serious then. And I think everybody's fairly familiar about the range of the talks, other than to say there were constitutional issues, major constitutional issues. That was a fundamental part of the agreement. A section on institutions, which was where we're having the problem now. Strand 1 dealing with relations within Northern Ireland, Strand 2 between the north and the south of the island, and Strand 3 between Ireland and Britain. The next section was on material on rights and safeguards, highly important for the new dispensation we were seeking to build, was a fair and equitable place for all. The next section was on police and injustice, which was a total reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary, which had been the police force in Northern Ireland, that was seen even by peaceful nationalists like John Hume, Seamus Mallon, as not fit for purpose, and wanted a total reform of that. And the justice end was effectively amending 30 years of fairly draconian legislation, which was understandable because of the Troubles. And then the last two bits were taking a range of issues which could be summed up as things that have to do with the ending of the conflict, from decommissioning of arms to demilitarization of the security situation in the north. It's probably worth mentioning that there was about 80,000 people on the payroll of the security in the north, between the British Army, the police, between the Ulster Defence Regiment, which were part-time police, and some other sections of MI5, MI6, and other security apparatus. And then the last bit was the methodology for securing endorsing of the people north and south of whatever we agreed on, which we can ultimately did on the 22nd of May 1998. The talks process, when we hit that last 3 weeks, and I just covered the last 3 weeks, were really to get agreement across the constitutional issues, which effectively was over to me mainly on was I prepared to change the Irish Constitution, the 1937 Constitution, on Articles 2 and 3 of the Constitution. There have been quite a lot of talk on that and documents on that around the framework document, which was published in February 1995. And that was an important document. Most of the work in that was done by Albert Reynolds, finished by John Bruton, and that was then used as the basis for the constitutional discussion. Articles 2 and 3 effectively claim jurisdiction by the south of Ireland over Northern Ireland, and the Government of Ireland Act 1920, Section 75, which really set up Northern Ireland, that was on the British side, because that kind of claimed jurisdiction over the whole island. An important point to make is, because a lot of talk about the Act of Union, which has nothing to do with the Good Friday Agreement talks, nothing whatsoever. It was those two documents that I've mentioned, and it was the dropping of both of those by the Irish government, the British government, led to the new position of consent. Needless to say, Articles 2 and 3 were difficult to sell to the Irish public at the time, and sell to my own party at the time. Then on the other side was North-South bodies. North-South bodies were where the Irish government and the executive, Irish government through Ministerial Council, and the executive in Northern Ireland by the new ministers in Northern Ireland would work on a range of issues. The talks process nearly broke down on that issue in the last week, because the unions felt that there was too many areas, and particularly because there was executive powers, and they didn't like the idea that these new organisations would be not answerable to Stormont. Anyway, when we got over that, and we got over that because I changed, even though we'd agreed this with the British government the previous week, and had signed off on it with the British government, the unions wouldn't agree. Famously, John Taylor, one of the unions negotiators, said he wouldn't touch it with a 40-foot pole. That created a huge amount of problem at the time, became a huge issue. When we resolved that, we finally resolved, on this day, 25 years ago, we resolved Strand 1, which was the unionists and nationalists working together in Strand 1. The final issues of the talks, I think what Tony Blair and I did was we worked for an inclusive process, having everybody in we could. And it was the first time that those associated with the combatants on either side were in the talks. As we all know, that's a difficult thing for sovereign governments to do, because you're bringing people in who've been associated or involved in violence directly, indirectly, or by association. But we felt the only way we were going to make progress, and based on the failures of 1974, even though people really tried hard then, and in 1985, that the problem was they weren't inclusive. So A, we went for inclusive talks, B, we went for comprehensive talks. So not only were we dealing with the institutions, the constitutional issues, we dealt with demilitarization, we dealt with policing, we dealt with legislation. And I think that moving to where we are, we finally got there, but moving to where we are, I think, as you correctly said, Mark, I've always said, listen, we achieved what we achieved, we got peace, that has worked well. I think most of the other areas of agreement have been resolved. What hasn't been resolved is the bit that comes down to politicians. All the things that everyone else had to do has happened. Civic society, you know, dealing with demilitarization, with the British Army, MI5, MI6, all of those things have successfully happened. The reform of policing, which was a huge issue. Chris Patton of Hong Kong fame, former Tory Minister, Director of Elections, he chaired that. With Chrissy O'Toole and Maurice Hayes and others did a wonderful job. And the PSNI, as it's known as now, the Police Service in Northern Ireland, is seen internationally as being a very good police service. So it's the politicians that have left us down, and we've had numerous difficulties. First of all, Mandelson suspended the institutions way back over a thing called Stormont-gate. Then Sinn Féin postponed them over an environmental grant scheme, cash for ash, and nothing to do with the historical position between Ireland and England. It was a grant scheme. And then thirdly, Brexit, which was the biggest mistake ever made by the British government and the British people in 1,000 years. That's just me, tongue in cheek. But anyway, it caused us endless problems, as everybody knows. So we're where we are now. And hopefully, the politicians will deal with their outstanding issues. In the words of the experts on following the Windsor agreements, they have said that 97% of the issues to do with Brexit and trade and all of these things have been dealt with. There's 3% left. I suppose, rather than me giving you my own views and the frustrations around all of this, I'd say that what seems to be left is that the DUP, Jeffrey Donaldson and his colleagues, obviously have divisions within their ranks, and that's been quite clear. That's not for me to comment or deal with, but their argument is that they don't want any European Union legislation coming directly into Northern Ireland domain. That if there are things that are of an EU flavour or an EU legal basis, that it should be codified through EU law or UK law, and that they should have cover by UK law. That's the position. And I suppose that is now rest. The European Union are going to do no more. Maros Sefcovic and others who really worked hard on this, and I'm really grateful for the huge commitment they've given over the last number of years and the support we've got from EU partners. They're not going to do any more. But it seems that Rishi Sunak, you know, has an issue to whether he can or can't. I'm not saying this is simple by any means. He's been great for the last 6 months. He, you know, it's been a huge change of atmosphere from the Johnson government. He's been trying to be helpful and has been helpful to see if he can find an assurance, some assurance that he can give. I have to say the unions want this in legislation. I would have thought that wouldn't be necessary. I mean, it is their government that they look up to, and I would have thought they would have accepted assurance in these issues, but that's where we are. So if we could get over that hurdle, on we go. And I suppose the last thing I could say is the Good Friday Agreement has a review clause that from time to time we can have reviews. The one area, we've only had that once in October 2006 around St. Andrew's Agreement where we made certain changes. My own view, if we can get to the institution up and running, there is a need for a review to look at how we can stop this issue from arising again. And that has to be done by cross-community consent. Trying to impose these things, as you might in other countries, won't work in Northern Ireland. My long experience of dealing with the parties now for 40 years is that won't happen. So, but I do think it's possible to get agreement and to get issues it through. So I think that probably takes my time, Mark. I'm glad to come back and any questions afterwards, but it's a quick run through that last 12 months.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahern. I actually, one question came up while you were speaking from Derek Mooney, and maybe if it's okay, Federico, maybe I'll just ask the Prime Minister now so I don't forget later, but because it comes off where you left the end of your remarks, which is that, you know, the Tory government in the UK has talked a lot recently about strengthening the UK, strengthening the union. Is that kind of rhetoric compatible with the principles of the agreement? Or do you worry that sort of a renewed emphasis on the strength or integrity of the union is in some ways at odds with the spirit of power sharing and the Good Friday Agreement? And then I'll introduce the panel after that.
Yeah, no, Derek Mooney is correct. I do worry about it because it's a finely balanced document, Mark. And the reality of it is that any changes to the 1998 Act that strengthen the union in one way create a difficulty on the balance on the other side. And I think people have to be very careful of that. And when I hear people, you know, talking now about some of these changes, I urge caution. And if I can just, because it is a hugely important question, and this is my answer, that when Tony Blair and I signed the British-Irish Agreement, which was the associate agreement to the multi-party talks, one of the key things we were doing was reaching a new balanced accommodation of the status of Northern Ireland. So in effect, as the point I made earlier on, the trade-off between Section 75 of the Government of Ireland Act and changing the Irish Constitution, which claimed jurisdiction over the Irish state. And both of these claims were withdrawn and replaced by new arrangements that I think I covered. So the net effect of that, Mark, is that Northern Ireland is different. Northern Ireland is not the same as Finchley. So those that say that Northern Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom, yes, it is. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. And it can only be changed by the consent of the people. But is Northern Ireland the same as anywhere else? The answer to that is no, because the net effect of the new accommodation was to make Northern Ireland different to the rest of Ireland. And I think nationalists and Republicans have to take that on board. But without questioning, its status based on principle and sense makes it continue to be part of the UK. No argument about that. But the way the sovereignty associated with the status was to be exercised was different. And that was the trade-off. So an amendment to 1998 is strengthening the union. You can't strengthen the union without upsetting the balance. I mean, I think it's obvious. If there was a trade-off, that people accepted that it was based on consent, dropping the constitutional claim. I think any fair person would say that issue was dealt with and shouldn't be touched. Shouldn't be touched.
Thank you, and thank you also for that great sort of walkthrough of you know, I remember I used to cover George Mitchell years later when he was trying to make peace in the Middle East, and he always liked to refer back to his time negotiating on the Good Friday Agreement. He would always say we had 700 days of failure and 1 day of success. And your review of how all of this unfolded made it almost feel inevitable the way you described it. But of course, it was far from inevitable at the time. And it took a huge amount of resilience and courage and grit for all of you to keep going, I'm sure, through all of those setbacks. I'm going to now move on to the panel, but with one housekeeping note, which is that you're all invited to send in questions, which I would urge you to put into the chat to me. You could either just send a general question and I will throw it out to any and all of the panelists, or if you want to address to a specific panelist or to the Taoiseach, just let me know. So with that, why don't we move directly to the panel, which has two great people. We're going to start with Mary Murphy, who, as you heard earlier, is a lecturer in the Department of Government and Politics at UCC. She specializes in the EU and Northern Ireland politics. And then joining us from Princeton, New Jersey is Federico Fabbrini, full professor of European law at the School of Government and Law at Dublin City University. And he's an expert, among other things, in some of the mechanics of the Windsor Framework, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And so hopefully we will hear a bit from him on how all of that is going to play out. But why don't I start first by giving the floor to Professor Mary Murphy, and maybe she can, among other things, walk us through some of that complicated political landscape that the Taoiseach alluded to toward the end of his remarks and where she sees all that playing out. So with that, Mary, why don't I turn over to you?
Thanks very much, Mark, and thanks to Federico for the invite, and special thanks to Bertie for that overview. It was a reminder of that time and all of the challenges and difficulties that attached to that time. And I was living in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, during the 1990s. So I was actually there when the Good Friday Agreement was being negotiated. And I remember this week, 25 years ago in particular, as a time primarily of great hope, and a time of great excitement, a time of sadness too, as people reflected on the previous 25 years. So it's great to see that we're celebrating it and marking it 25 years later. So when Federico asked me to contribute to this panel, I thought I would do it in a few ways. And one of the first things I wanted to sort of stress, I suppose, is when I think of the Good Friday Agreement, I think primarily of the good, of the positive outcomes from that document. And, you know, you can list them off as the Good Friday Agreement saved lives in the first instance. And I think we must always remember that. It stopped violence, and it created stability. It also, over the years that followed, helped to achieve some degree of economic regeneration in Northern Ireland, which was essential for cementing the peace process at that time. As Bertie referred to it as well, it institutionalized relationships between Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland, but also on the island of Ireland, between North, South, and across the two islands between Britain and Ireland. And they were similarly essential components of what the peace process had to be during this period. But I think more than anything, what it did is it accommodated competing identities and competing political aspirations. And that allowed the agreement to have a strong degree of legitimacy, which of course is essential in terms of implementing any peace document at all. So there's much about the Good Friday Agreement that has to be positively acknowledged, but I suppose it would be remiss of us not to accept that there are elements of the Good Friday Agreement as well, which perhaps don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. And it has experienced and encountered a whole series of challenges and obstacles down through the years. I mean, right now, the institutions created by the Good Friday Agreement are suspended. They were also suspended at the time of the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. So down through the years, for about 1/3 of the period since 1998, those institutions have not been operational. And perhaps it's been too easy to bring those institutions down in the way that it's transpired over the years. So that's one issue we must acknowledge. There are also issues around some of the mechanics and institutions that the Good Friday Agreement contained. And there have been criticisms of those mechanics in relation to, for example, cross-community voting mechanisms, the manner in which the First and Deputy First Minister are elected. And there's something to be said about that, I think, particularly if we reflect on recent years and the way in which political party configuration in Northern Ireland has changed. And Mark, you referred in particular at the start to the growth in the size of the vote for the Alliance Party, those who identify as others within Northern Ireland. So there have been those criticisms of the institutions as well. And I suppose as we now mark the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, it begs questions about the extent to which institutions and mechanics created for a particular time and a particular situation, whether they are fully appropriate to the period in which we find ourselves now. Some of the other issues around the Good Friday Agreement, I suppose, would concern the failure to advance reconciliation in the truest sense. And I think there are many in and around the agreement who would regret the fact that reconciliation has not transpired to the fullest possible extent. And I suppose we see that maybe most manifestly in relation to separation, division and segregation in Northern Ireland. In key areas, but maybe particularly in relation to education, with over 90% of schools in Northern Ireland being drawn from a single religion. There would have been an expectation that some of that segregation might have been overcome to a greater extent than it has been since 1998. So they are perhaps some of the ways in which we should recognise that the agreement has not been as successful as we might have initially hoped. But let me think as well about some of the key characteristics of the agreement. And one of the key characteristics of the agreement is the way in which ambiguity was used in terms of structuring the agreement, in terms of wording the agreement. That has been a very important tool at the heart of the agreement, which allowed the agreement, I suppose, to evolve and to adapt over time to specific needs and interests and even crises. One of the key characteristics of the agreement, however, and I say this against the Brexit backdrop, is one of the things that it stopped us talking about the border as an issue of contestation in Irish politics. That was one of its key outcomes. And again, that is specifically against the Brexit backdrop. So we effectively stopped talking about the Irish question in inverted commas. And there was little reference to constitutional change in the period after 1998. And you can actually see that quite tangibly in relation to the opinion polling that was conducted after 1998. In the period from 1998 up to a year or two before Brexit, the extent to which that question was asked was far, far less than it is in the period since 2016. And in fact, if you look at the visual of when the question was asked in the Republic of Ireland, for a period of almost 20 years, the question wasn't asked at all by opinion pollsters. So that, of course, was all facilitated. That ability to stop talking about the border was a consequence of the agreement, but it was very much facilitated by Irish and British membership of the European Union and the single European market in particular. And that's, of course, because the single European market is premised on free movement and open borders. And it served as a means of basically enabling the essential cross-border dimensions of the Good Friday Agreement itself. But as we know, the UK decision to leave the EU, I suppose, challenged that particular aspect and characteristic of the Good Friday Agreement. So I suppose where does that leave us today, and what does all this mean, particularly given that we've been asked to reflect as well on the Windsor Framework? Well, I think we can draw some parallels between the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998 and the Windsor Framework in 2023. There are some similarities. They're very different documents, of course, but there are some ways in which these documents are similar. And the first point I would make about this is that both documents are complex documents and they're cumbersome documents, but they are essentially based on a compromise. Both documents contain some very novel, some might even say unusual arrangements, which are specific to Northern Ireland itself. There is also in both documents that element of ambiguity that I talked about, where certain issues and implementation measures are actually subject to future dialogue and agreement, like as Bertie mentioned in relation to the Police Service of Northern Ireland. The reform of that service happened after 1998. The agreement, the 1998 agreement, the 2023 Windsor Framework, they do ask a lot of the political class in Northern Ireland as well. And what's critical here is that the legitimacy of both of these agreements depends on cross-community buy-in. So we need both communities to support these documents in order for them to be implemented and legitimized. Now, if we go back to 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, in the referendum that happened on the 22nd of May 1998, we saw support for the agreement at over 70% of the Northern Ireland electorate. Now, in the latest survey from Queen's University Belfast by my colleagues Katie Hayward and David Finnemore, they have been testing the temperature on the Windsor Framework. And their latest survey, which was only published this week, shows that support for the Windsor Framework hovers 1% below that 70% mark at 69%. And that support is echoed across civil society. And it was the same for the Good Friday Agreement. Key sectoral interests, from business to agriculture to logistics, et cetera, have welcomed the Windsor Framework in the same way as they welcomed the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998. Now, all that being said, I suppose it is important that we acknowledge that although there's majority support for the framework, that masks a considerable degree of opposition to the framework, which is concentrated predominantly within the unionist community. And it's the DUP which typifies that opposition, that strong opposition, unionist opposition towards the framework. But again, if we reflect back on that period in 1998, the DUP had a similar level of antipathy towards the Good Friday Agreement. You'll recall, and as Bertie has already acknowledged, they withdrew from the all-party talks before 1998, before the agreement was signed. During the subsequent referendum, they campaigned for a no vote on the Good Friday Agreement. Even after the devolution of powers, after the referendum, they were very slow to engage with the power-sharing institutions. And their opposition to the agreement continued after 1998. So just as is the case now, and as was the case then, the DUP are, I suppose, largely alone in terms of their hostility to what is, I suppose, a widely supported compromise. The vast majority of the other political parties in Northern Ireland are in support of the Windsor Framework. Even after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, and again, Bertie alluded to it, there were many years of difficulty. There were suspensions, there were setbacks, there had been various different crises, and there has been difficulties on occasion in implementing the different provisions of the agreement. The agreement itself has been reviewed and revised over time. It's been changed by subsequent agreements, but the DUP did eventually participate. And that process of achieving the parties' engagement, it required a lot of patience, and it required a lot of perseverance, and it required dialogue, and it required conciliation. But having said that, against that backdrop, the Good Friday Agreement endured, and it survived, its faults and failings all in. So then what do you take from this? Well, I suppose maybe we can take heart. maybe we can acknowledge that in 1998, the DUP had difficulties, but eventually signed up. And maybe we can hope that in 2023, a similar situation will transpire.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was terrific. I want to let the people out in the audience know that I am taking note of questions that have come in. And I think, though, rather than pose those questions right now, I'd like to let Federico Fabbrini do his presentation, and then we can kind of collect all the questions and do a Q&A at the end. So without any further delay, Federico, why don't you take the floor, and then we'll go do a Q&A immediately after that.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that. And thank you also warmly for agreeing to chair this panel this afternoon. I want to contribute to today's topic, picking up basically where Mary left, as I want to focus specifically on the Windsor Framework, complementing some of the things that Bertie has said as well. And I basically want to make 3 points this afternoon. The first one is that in my view, the Windsor Framework has to be seen within the context of the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, as in my view, EU-UK reconciliation was an important goal ahead of this milestone celebration. The second point is that from a formal legal viewpoint, the Windsor Framework brings about only a limited amount of changes to the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland. So it's not a kind of a wholesale revision of the protocol as it is sometimes being described. However, and that's my third and last point, actually, the institution of the Good Friday Agreement, shared devolved governance of Northern Ireland, are at the heart of what is the most significant innovation introduced by the Windsor Framework, and that's the Stormont break. And I want to say something about that. So I'll tease out these 3 points very quickly, and hopefully that will provide some food for thought for the Q&A afterwards. So let me begin with the obvious bit, which is that obviously I think the Windsor Framework is an important development in EU-UK relation designed to rebuild trust between the parties. I think it's fair to acknowledge that over the last 4 or 5 years, relationship between the EU and the UK had been at an all-time low. Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Liz Truss had actually gained political points at home by antagonizing the European Union and had sort of found strong domestic incentives for keeping sort of a confrontational relationship with Brussels. The geostrategic context has changed profoundly since last February with the explosion of the war in Ukraine, and that I think has created condition for a rapprochement between the EU and the UK, which stand together on this major geostrategic challenge for the European continent. And then, of course, we should not sort of underplay the influence of the United States in all this. Clearly, the Americans have been pushing for Britain and the EU to get closer together, and for the UK in particular for solving the problem around Northern Ireland. And I think with the rise to power of Rishi Sunak as new prime ministers, that conditions were now met for that reconciliation to occur. So as I said, I think the Windsor Framework is mending ties between the parties. And that's also reflected in the decision by the United Kingdom to withdraw the proposed Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which would have been clearly in breach of the international legal obligation of the UK, but also the decision of the European Commission to suspend the infringement proceedings against the United Kingdom. So I think from a political point of view, the Windsor Framework achieves an important goal, which is to improve relationship between the parties ahead of this important anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. However, and that's my second legal my second point, from a legal viewpoint, I think it's important to emphasize that despite the rhetoric, the Windsor Framework is not a new treaty. It's not a new agreement between the parties that replaces the Protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, which, as we know, had become very controversial in the Protestant community in Northern Ireland. On the contrary, what the Windsor Framework is really is a political deal between the EU and the UK, which has now been incorporated within the protocol through the action of the Joint Committee. So on the 24th of March, a couple of weeks ago, basically the Joint Committee, which is the treaty-created body under the withdrawal agreement, and it's composed of representatives by the EU and the UK, has adopted a decision to effectively incorporate within the framework of the protocol the arrangements of the Windsor Framework. And that has led to a tiny amendment to the text of the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and then to the repeal and replacement of prior decisions of the Joint Committee relating to free movement of goods and VAT rules. So as we know, the key areas where the Windsor Framework has really produced changes compared to the past is the creation of this green versus red lane, effectively making movement of goods from Great Britain to Northern Ireland easier when these goods are not at risk of moving to the Republic of Ireland. Secondly, enhancing, let's say, the flexibility of UK authorities in applying EU VAT rules and some state aid norms into Northern Ireland. And then last and definitely not least, in fact, perhaps the most important of all, the Windsor Framework has introduced this new mechanism, the Stormont break, which is really the only formal amendment to the protocol, which has been brought about by this agreement concluded earlier in February. So let me come to the Stormont break and say something about that. Again, I think there's been some confusion about this instrument, but what the Stormont break is designed to do is to give Northern Ireland the possibility of suspend the application of EU law in Northern Ireland, but this only concerns new or amended EU norms that would need to be applied in Northern Ireland because they are part of the EU internal market. So it's not a retroactive tool. It doesn't apply to the EU laws that are already applicable in Northern Ireland as a result of the protocol. It would only come into being for amended or future laws that the European Union introduces, which were not already included in the annex to the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. So it is a pretty narrow and specific instrument that has been inserted into the text of the protocol now with the aim of assuaging what has been called a possible democratic deficit in the protocol. Now, I can come back and discuss about the alleged democratic deficit in the Q&A. I believe there was no democratic deficit, but certainly this is an improvement that the European Union has agreed to make in agreement with the UK. However, what I think is very interesting, particularly for the purpose of our afternoon conversation, is that this Stormont break, which is now Article 13(3)(a) of the protocol, fully relies on the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. In particular, the Stormont break must be activated, can be activated by 30 members of the local assemblies and MLAs, that must come from at least two parties. From this point of view, the break resembles entirely the so-called petition of concern under the Good Friday Agreement. But even more importantly, and I think that's a point that has not been emphasized sufficiently, the Stormont break will only be operational if the Northern Ireland executive is restored and assuming the Northern Ireland Assembly is in session. And I think this was a very clever legal choice that was made in the context of the Windsor Framework by the parties, because I think it increases enormously the pressure for parties in Northern Ireland to actually go back and make sure the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are functioning, because if those institutions are not functioning, then the Stormont break cannot be operationalized. So this clever use, I think, of the Windsor Framework and of the sort of post-Brexit legal arrangement is, in my opinion, an interesting choice that was made by the United Kingdom to incentivize and support the continuing functioning of the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And we have heard from prior speakers that, of course, things on the ground are difficult and there are strong resistances. But ironically, what I think has happened now for the first time is using the post-Brexit legal infrastructure to actually beef up the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, which is obviously different than what we had seen up to this point, where usually, as Bertie Ahern previously mentioned, Brexit challenged profoundly the functioning of the GFA institution. So there might be some hope, or at least the glass half full, moving forward. But I'll stop here and happy to discuss further. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Federico. Why don't I throw the first question to you, since we've just come off your remarks, and it's specifically about the Windsor Framework, and that is this. You alluded to the role and the influence of the United States in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. Are there any specific ways the US played a role in the Windsor Framework negotiations? Can any of the success in coming to that deal be attributed to influence, pressure, anything else from the US?
Thank you. This is a very good question. I think the influence of the U.S. In the negotiation of the Windsor Framework was more indirect than what it was during the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, but it should not be underplayed, as I said, and that's in my view for two reasons. One is with Biden, President Biden in the White House, the U.S. administration has been extremely clear that it didn't want Brexit to undermine the peace process in Northern Ireland, and Biden has President Biden has repeatedly sort of emphasized his Irish roots and his support for the position of the Irish government. So that put, I think, the UK government on notice that it would have been very dangerous to sort of go down the route that Johnson and Truss had taken of confronting the EU, reneging on the legal obligation signed in the protocol. So there was that dimension. And then I think the second is even more indirect, but still highly significant, and is connected with as I said, the explosion of the war in Ukraine following Russia illegal aggression in February 2022. I think this is a Zeitenwende for Europe, is a change of time for the European continent. The war returns on the European continent, and in a sense, the war has also reflected how the EU and the UK, despite having separated, continue to share a similar Weltanschauung, a similar vision of the world based on the rule of law, democracy, human rights. And from that point of view, the role of the US within the framework of NATO and NATO-EU cooperation has, in my view at least, again pushed in the direction of saying, okay, you can't fight for Northern Ireland once we have a real war in Ukraine. Those are problems that can be solved, and I think with the Windsor Framework have been solved, and should be solved, because we have now other geostrategic priorities that have to be taken care of on the European continent. And I think Rishi Sunak clearly saw that as the new UK Prime Minister, and was very keen on demining the protocol as a point of contention with the European Union. And I think, as I said, the framework achieves that objective.
Thanks. That question, by the way, came from Michelle Egan, and the next one comes from Connor Kelly, and it's actually directed to the Taoiseach. So Bertie, if I could bring you back into things. The question is, the Good Friday Agreement specifically commits the UK government to incorporation into Northern Ireland law of the European Convention on Human Rights. Should the debate around the Human Rights Act and the, quote, British Bill of Rights in the Conservative Party worry us?
Yeah, I think this is an issue that has come up a number of times because of the European Union, their strong position on human rights, that obviously any of the conventions of that should apply to Northern Ireland. I think there's been a lot of assurances and commitments given that there wouldn't be any changes and people would still be able to deal with that. But until it's tested, we don't know. But I think the British government have been in pains probably since 2016 to be very clear on that they there won't be any changes, or that nobody would be removed from being able to make their cases. But we wait to see if there's a test. I hope that doesn't become an issue. Can I just mention one issue, Mark, that I think was important there, and it's back to Federico, because there is a case. I just want to mention what unionist concern is on the point, Federico. The Windsor Agreement, he is correct that the Windsor Agreement is about new directives or new protocols or new issues that might emanate from the European Union. That is the correct position. But there is a bill pending in Westminster, which is to amend all acts back to 1973 that will, in one piece of legislation, throw out, if we put it bluntly, all of the acts that are there. So the question arises: what happens? Are all those old ones then new ones? And how is that going to be interpreted? Now, this is a question which remains unanswered and wasn't answered by the protocol and wasn't answered by the Windsor Agreement. And I just want to make that point, because if the British government, and some British politicians say, oh, that act will never be enacted. But as of now, there's a commitment from the Rishi Sunak's government, as there was from his two immediate predecessors, that all of this legislation will change by the 31st of the 12th of this year. So that would mean that all of these acts have been there since 1973 are gone. Are they going to be classified under the Windsor Agreement as new things? So it is a very, very important question. I don't know if
Interesting.
I have a view on that, but I'd be very interested from the legal point.
You want to throw Federico, take a shot at that?
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Bert. I think you're indeed raising an important point. I mean, this idea of a great repeal of all EU laws from the United Kingdom actually goes back to Theresa May already. So it was there in earnest from the very early moments of the Brexit process. What I think, however, it's important to emphasize from a legal point of view is that if that were ever to be approved by the UK Parliament, it would not affect Northern Ireland, and that's because the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, which is part of the withdrawal agreement, legally commits the UK to continuously apply a large number, although in specific sectors, of EU laws into Northern Ireland. So norms about the functioning of the internal market, norms about taxation, some norms about state aid are going to be continuously applicable with regard to Northern Ireland, because they have been regarded as essential to secure north-south trade and prevent the establishment of a border in the island of Ireland. So the risk that we would face if this great repeal type of legal approach were to succeed in Westminster is that the divergence between Northern Ireland and Great Britain would increase even further. And so I think the UK here faces itself with a conundrum. One strategy is to say, okay, we can do a bonfire of EU laws after Brexit, but the risk of it is to actually increase the divergence between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or the other is to say, well, probably a lot of these norms are actually sensible and were adopted when the UK was a member of the EU, and the UK had a vote and a voice in their approval. And so probably we can keep several of this, which would also make trade easier between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because there's effectively no or limited divergence. So we will have to see how that plays out. But I think legally speaking, the application of EU laws in Northern Ireland is sort of rock solid, because it's entrenched in the protocol, which the UK agreed to.
Okay, so I have quite a few questions. I have another one that has been addressed to Bertie, but I'd love to maybe bring Mary into the conversation too on this one. So the question is, can you talk a little bit about how the scope of a review of the Good Friday Agreement might work practically? At least one party in Northern Ireland is very nervous about a review of Strand 1, which is what the Alliance Party is calling for. They fear that it will open a can of worms and essentially set up a renegotiation of the Good Friday Agreement. Maybe start with the Prime Minister, and if Mary wants to jump in, since she mentioned the Alliance earlier, that would be interesting.
Mark, I agree with everything Mary said earlier on. I think a review of the workings of the agreement, in my view, doesn't fundamentally change the agreement. So I've no problem whatever about 25 years on, and on the experiences that we have been down as much as we've been up in the institutions, and we've all kind of other problems that arose along the way, is an absolute, perfect reason and a desirable reason why we should have a review of these things. So I think we had one review which changed some of these things for the better or worse, and that's another argument, but some people say better, or some say worse, but we did that in 2006. So this would just be the same. And alliance have definitely a point of view, there's no doubt about that. And you know how the First Minister, Deputy First Minister is shaped, which we made a change to in 2006, which very much annoyed the Ulster Unionist Party. So I think these things are quite appropriate to have a review of the mechanisms. The only thing I'd have to say, Mark, and this is where the problem arises, is if you try to do them without cross-community consent, you won't get agreement, and this is the difficulty. Now, I think if you tried to have this discussion prior to the institutions coming up, we'd probably never get there. But I've spoken to all the parties about this over the last, 15 months, and I think they do know the weaknesses, and I do think they're prepared to, to try and find solutions to them. But if you try to do it with cross-community consent, without cross-community consent, it's not me saying this, I just can tell you from the answers I got from the leaders that they just won't agree. And unfortunately, and I hate saying this, but they're very good at not agreeing. So, we have to try and carry them with you.
Thanks, Bertie. And Mary, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Mark. I agree entirely with Bertie. And I do think that key point is any revisions would have to enjoy cross-community support. Otherwise, they're just not legitimate and they become very difficult to implement and to operationalize. But I see no reason why a review or revisions to the existing terms of the agreement would in any way challenge the spirit of the agreement. It is still an agreement and always will be an agreement which is founded on consent, and that's been continuously reiterated since 1998, and even throughout the Brexit period, every iteration of the Windsor Framework before it has been grounded in the principle of consent. But I at the same time, I do think there is a logic and a rationale for taking a look at the institutions and some of the mechanisms around it at this 25-year juncture. And whether that's in relation to the designation of identities or the way in which cross-community voting happens or what you call the Deputy First Minister, there's lots that could be put on the table. And I think it would be right and appropriate, given all that has happened in the period since 1998, and particularly in relation to the way in which the political party system has reconfigured, to allow for representation to be as inclusive as it can possibly be in the governance of Northern Ireland. And in saying all of that, I don't for a moment underestimate the difficulties in actually getting to a point where we will achieve cross-community agreement on how the institutions might be changed. We need an enabling atmosphere. We need positive mindsets, and we need optimism and security about the future before the parties will necessarily be able to have those conversations.
Just a quick follow-up, Mary, from Michelle Egan, because it's sort of tangent. It seems to be in the same area. The EU now allows for the concept of differentiated integration with opt-outs and flexibility for specific member states. Is the Stormont break essentially a similar model to that?
Gosh.
A bit technical, I know.
That is a technical question. I mean, Federico is probably better placed to answer this. But the Stormont break is, as Federico said, it's a very clever tool, and it does facilitate differentiation. But I would hazard a guess that the expectation is that the break would never be pulled. It's going to be difficult to pull this particular break. There are quite a few to jump through. But nevertheless, it does provide a capacity for a break to be put on Northern Ireland's relationship with the single European market. So I suppose in that way, it does fulfill some of that sort of differentiated integration model that the EU has toyed with down through the years. But Federico may want to jump in.
Do you want to take a quick shot at that, Federico?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mary and Mark, and thanks to Michelle for the question. I do agree that in a sense, the Stormont break is an example of external differentiated integration. The UK is no longer a member state of the EU. Differentiated integration is usually inside the EU, with some member states having opt-outs from some EU policies, whereas here you have a non-member state or a former member state, but part of its territory is still part of the EU, and it has this instrument of flexibility that has now been introduced. I would like to remind just everybody that, of course, the protocol already had a sort of a similar, although much more explosive tool, which is the Article 18 of the protocol, whereby, as people will remember, every 4 years, potentially every 8, the Assembly of Northern Ireland was given the right to effectively opt out en bloc from the key treaty articles of the protocol that kept Northern Ireland within the EU internal market. And that was a major negotiating win by Boris Johnson when he renegotiated the protocol back in October 2019, because it effectively gave to the elected representatives of Northern Ireland the right to periodically reapprove their subjection to EU internal market laws. I think what the Stormont break introduced by the Windsor Framework does is to kind of introduce a retail mechanism to side this wholesale mechanism under Article 18. The consent procedure under Article 18 would have suspended the application of all EU laws into Northern Ireland. The Stormont break is much more narrow, specific, and as I said earlier, will only concern future EU norms. But from that point of view, it is perhaps more helpful, because if a real problem on the ground emerges as a consequence of a new EU law, then it can be dealt with.
There is a worry, Mark,
sorry, go ahead,
Mark, by some politicians in the north that, you know, they see the break, that it could be quite divisive, because they feel that even though it's kind of specified that there should be very limited circumstances where the break would apply, that if those who tend to be anti the agreement and anti maybe the overall Good Friday Agreement in the first place, and there is a number of clever people who hold that position, who are legally minded, that they might all the time be calling on the other politicians who are in positions of power to apply the break, knowing that they wouldn't be able to apply the break because it's so specified, but they would be running the media campaign and the anti-campaign against them to say, oh, you know, there's a break in that agreement. You should, on this issue, whatever the issue was, you should apply the break. And unfortunately, I think that's a real concern. And a lot of the politicians, at least a good number of them, tend to see the break as not being useful or clever, but as potentially being divisive. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree, but I'm just giving you what their view is.
Interesting. Actually, so I since that question was a bit technical, at least at the start, I thought I would throw out a much less technical question, and this one is also addressed to Bertie, although if either of the other two panelists want to take a shot at it, and here is the question: what is the likelihood of a united Ireland or the reunification of Ireland in the next 10 years?
Well,
I'm not gonna take this one.
well,
maybe no one wants to take it, but that's a question that a lot of people have in the back of their mind.
No, I know. I'm glad to answer the question, but I needless to say, I'm a Republican, so I would love to see a united Ireland or an agreed Ireland, which I rather say nowadays, because I think that's the best chance. But there's this proviso, and I think these are the two essential issues. One is that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, or whatever amendments that might arise, which I think will, that they should be operational for a considerable length of time. And I don't mean 12 months, I mean a considerable length of time, that they're seen to function and be operative and useful, and stop the difficulties that we've suffered over the last 20 years or so. That's number one. And number two, after looking at what happened in Brexit and looking after what happened in the Scottish referendum, any referendum that doesn't comprehensively and in great detail answer and deal with all of the issues will not pass, in my view. So therefore, you know, there's a huge amount of work that has to take place on what a new Ireland would look like, how we would integrate all our various administrative institutions, not to forget money for a minute, that's another issue, but all how would you actually do it? How would it function? Would Northern Ireland still have an assembly of its own? You know, would people be elected to Northern Ireland Assembly, would be elected to Dáil Éireann? So how would we integrate our police forces? How we integrate our various departments? I actually believe all that is possible. I think it's possible once nobody asks you to do it overnight. But the necessary work has only commenced, including academic research, and you know, Dublin City University are part of that, and Federico's colleagues are part of that, and other universities are doing it as well. So the question says within 10 years. I think that's fair. I think that's what you're talking about. But it will go to the people. It was, some people like to forget this now, but it was, Mark, an essential part of getting agreement on this day 25 years ago, or tomorrow 25 years ago, that there was a clause in that from time to time there would be votes on a border poll or on a unification poll, which I'd rather say. So I think if you were to say maybe the first vote would be within the decade, I think that's reasonable enough. But if the preparatory work isn't done, there's no point in having that referendum.
Mary, do you have anything to add to that, or a different view?
No, I don't really. I mean, I think there will likely be a referendum within the next decade, but that's not to say there will be a united Ireland within the next decade. So, you know, I concur with everything that Bertie has said in relation to how you prepare for that moment of the referendum. That preparation will be absolutely essential. And I think also we need to prepare ourselves for some very difficult conversations and for a considerable number of challenges and a degree of sacrifice as well, if a united Ireland is to become a reality. Because I think what sometimes we don't sufficiently recall about the Good Friday Agreement this time 25 years ago is that those people who voted for it, many of them found it very difficult to vote for the Good Friday Agreement because of things like police reform and because of things like the early release of prisoners. But we will be having conversations, not quite as intense as that, but we will be having conversations about our police force and about our army and about our flag and about symbols and all these sorts of things, which can be hugely emotive and very difficult and challenging for many people. So we shouldn't underestimate the challenge ahead. And I think that's why preparation is so essential to the discussion that precedes any referendum in the next decade.
Thanks, Mary. We're almost down to the end, but I hope I might invoke the moderator's privilege to ask a question, because I thought that the Taoiseach said something interesting in his opening remarks. He talked about how when he came into office and Tony Blair came into office, they each agreed to sort of talk to a different constituency. And in Blair's case, it was to talk to the unionists and try to reassure the unionists. And I sort of wondered about that in the current context, because it seems to me that certainly the Johnson government and the Truss government, you know, by some accounts, really whipped up sentiment in the unionist movement in Northern Ireland, and I think contributed to maybe the fact that the unionists are so far out on a limb against the protocol. I mean, after all, it was Brexiteers who pushed a lot of that. And I just wondered whether I'd be interested in the Prime Minister's view on this. What should the UK government do now vis-a-vis the unionists that can try to kind of give them a route back, give them a reason to buy into this? Because I think it's probably a fair critique to say that some of the DUP's position on this is the result of years of Brexit-related rhetoric. So what's the path back? And is Rishi Sunak actually already on that path? Is he doing the right thing?
Yeah. I think that's it. That definitely it sets out where we're going, Mark, into the future of how the Rishi Sunak's government will deal with it. Remember at the start, Theresa May said, back in Lancaster House in 2017, her first speech 6 months after the referendum result, her first big speech, she said we were leaving the single market, we were leaving the customs union. It was out of everything, and a lot of us in that 6 months after the summer vote thought that maybe they would stay in the customs union, and maybe the problems wouldn't be as bad. We were all devastated after the vote, but we thought maybe we'd be able to work our way out. Then Theresa May realised in 2017 that Ireland was a factor in this. And to her credit, she changed ground, and then she said, well, maybe the thing to do is that the whole of the United Kingdom stay in the customs union, and by extension, parts of the single market. Now, that was a very good solution, but as we know, because we all watched on TV, all of the crisis movements that happened, and poor Theresa May wasn't, in spite of her best efforts, and I admired her efforts, she wasn't able to retrieve this position. So I'd like to think, jumping to now into your question, I'd like to think that Rishi Sunak will help the unionists to buy into, an amended, maybe slightly amended philosophy of the Windsor document that will satisfy unionists to see that all these laws that do come through the UK, and because it doesn't really worry me. Like if they want to take what the EU instruments are and put them through the UK in some way that satisfy the unions, well, that's fine. I think that's fine. But so I hope he keeps at it. I hope he keeps working at it to try to get them across the line and give them the assurances, not change the balance as I answered your first question earlier on from Derek, but to see that there's no change in the balance, but that there is an assurance. I mean, nobody that I have met wants to do anything to the unionists, and particularly to Democratic Unionist Party. I know most of these people very well, other than to be helpful to them. We just want them to live and be part of working in Northern Ireland, have relationships with the South, the fact that they're still involved in Westminster, and nobody is against any of that, and we just want to be able to move on peacefully and successfully. And back to something you said yourself, Mark. I mean, there is an enormous opportunity for Northern Ireland over the next, say, decade, the remaining part of this decade. That they're part of the island economy, with all the north-south dimensions that's put forward by the employer groups, the IBEC and IDA and Invest Northern Ireland, Enterprise Ireland, the Chamber of Commerce movements. They build up that island economy. Secondly, that they're the integral part of the UK internal market, which was part of the issue. And thirdly, they're in the European Union. I mean, it is a wonderful opportunity, backed up by the European Union being very supportive, and backed up by the Biden administration prepared to have another economic conference to try to help more investment. And they're already seeing that in artificial intelligence and in other areas in Belfast. So, this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So I think none of us, and particularly those of us in the South, and the current politicians and guys like myself who were around 25 years ago, we just want to be helpful. We just want to move this on. And we've no agenda other than trying to work the agreement successfully for the people and for the population of Northern Ireland.
Thanks, Bertie. And I actually think that's a very good note to sort of end on, because after all, that is what the promise of the future is. But before I do that, I want to make sure that Mary and Federico don't have anything else they want to add. I think I've gone through the bulk of the questions. I apologize to a couple of you who I may have missed, partly because the print is tiny and I'm having trouble reading some of it on my screen. But Federico, are you fine to wrap up now, or do you want to say anything by way of closing?
No, I think we
Okay.
can close, Mark, and if I can maybe just say thank you so much for chairing this and agreeing to do this. I should also say Chris McCrudden was due to join us, but he just emailed me that he had a health issue, and so he couldn't make it in the end, and I'm very sorry for that. But it was a pleasure to have Mary and Bertie Ahern in this wonderful conversation this afternoon. So I think you should really end, Mark, on this.
I will, just to sort of add my thanks to all three of you. You actually made it all very easy, and it was fascinating to listen to the Prime Minister talk about history. I'm going to be in Belfast on April 17th, 18th, and 19th, so I hope I can run into you, Bertie, and meet in person. But thank you all for a really fascinating discussion on a very important moment in history. And with that, I appreciate everyone who tuned in, and I wish you all a happy Thursday afternoon. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much again.